Hi, I'm Judy Shintani from Foothill College, and today we're going to talk about Alice Neal. Behind me, you'll see one of her portraits, and she's a well-known feminist artist and famous American portrait artist. And we'll go through some slides. So here's a picture of Alice Neal in her older age, and she was always more interested in individuals than in types. Neal painted the immigrants, outsiders, and activists around her because she believed that art was duty-bound to represent the real social relations under which contemporary life was lived. She was one of the great portrait artists of the 20th century. She made starkly honest paintings of relatives, lovers, friends, and neighbors. She used distorted drawing and invented colors to reveal the characters beneath each sitter's physical appearance. She worked in obscurity for most of her career, painting a range of locals from salesmen to the homeless. During the last 2 decades of her life, she finally gained recognition, receiving many honors and awards. Her later paintings included portraits of celebrity artists like Andy Warhol, Marisol, and notable people like Mayor Ed Koch and Bella Abzug. She was born in 1900 in Marion Square, Pennsylvania, and died in 1984 in New York, New York. In 1918, after graduating from high school, she took the civil service exam and got a high-paying clerical position in order to help support her parents. After 3 years of working, taking art classes by night, she enrolled in the fine art program at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, which is now called Moore College of Art and Design, in 1921. In her student works, she rejected Impressionism, the popular style at the time, and instead embraced the Ashcan School of Realism. In 1924, Neal met Carlos Enriquez, an upper-class Cuban painter, and they married in 1925. She moved to Havana to live with Enriquez's family, and in this environment, she developed the foundations of her lifelong political consciousness and commitment to equality. Her daughter died of diphtheria, and the trauma infused the content of her paintings, setting a precedent for the themes of motherhood, loss, and anxiety that permeated her work for the duration of her career. Her husband left her with her second daughter, and Neal suffered a massive nervous breakdown, was hospitalized, and attempted suicide. She was placed in the suicide ward of the Philadelphia General Hospital. Deemed stable almost a year later, Neal was released from the sanitarium in 1931 and returned to her parents' home. During the Depression, Neal was one of the first artists to work for the World Progress Administration. At the end of 1933, Neal was offered a $30 a week payment to participate in the Public Works of Art project. She'd been living mostly in poverty until that point. Her work started gaining some recognition in the art world. She painted in a realist style, and her subjects were mostly during the Depression era, street scenes and communist thinkers and leaders. Many art critics today describe Neal's female nudes as truthful and honest portraits. At the time, the works were controversial in the art world because they questioned women's traditional role. Neal often painted women in social action or in public spaces, starkly challenging the spheres of femininity that most 19th century women artists existed and worked within. It is believed that Neal challenged the norms of women's roles in the household and in everyday life in her paintings. Neal's aim was not to paint the female body in an idealistic way. She wanted to paint in a truthful and honest manner, and she thought of herself as a realist painter. Okay, let's look at some videos.
Guy's Aunt by Alice Neal is a deeply penetrating portrait that combines the artist's unique vision of color and form to reveal the underlying psychology of its subject. Neal turned to family, friends, other artists, and an array of anonymous strangers to sit for her as she explored issues of identity, politics, and gender, ultimately creating a rich portrait of New York City in the 20th century. Alice Neel was raised in rural Pennsylvania and pursued an artistic education at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women. After graduating at the age of 25, she married Cuban painter Carlos Enriquez and resettled in Havana to start a family. However, after the death of her infant daughter and subsequent abandonment of her husband, Neel was left feeling helpless. The sequence of losses pushed Neel into depression, but allowed her to bring a unique psychological perspective to her portraiture that captured the joy of life's vicissitudes. She positions the sitter, as she does in many paintings, over an abstract and expressionistic rendering of color. In her honest representation of the body and its imperfections, Neel paints the skin in an unusual prismatic range of tones, including olive green, lavender, ochre yellow, bright blue, and crimson. This abstract approach to the background specifically recalls Helen Frankenthaler's iconic Mountains and Sea from 1952. The artists are linked as two of the most important female American painters of the 20th century, both fierce colorists in their own right. From the beginning, Neel found more interest in the works of old master portraitists such as Rembrandt, Titian, and Goya than in the sentimentalism of Impressionism and the misanthropy of abstract expressionism. The characteristic artist's studio chair is a quintessentially recurring motif throughout the history of portrait painting, and the current work calls to mind Van Gogh's rendering of Gauguin's chair. Many of Neel's subjects are portrayed seated in the mismatched chairs she kept scattered around her studio. All of these elements connect this work with Neel's most significant and iconic portrait, her own. Both Guy's Aunt and self-portrait from 1980 offer a striking challenge to idealized femininity with an authentic portrayal of the aging body. From the late 1960s, Neel's works have served as icons of the women's movement and feature prominently in collections of institutions including the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Experimental and ever-changing throughout her career, Neel remains steadfast to an honest account of beauty at all stages of life.
Alice Neel was born in Pennsylvania in 1900 and died in New York in 1984. Alice Neel is a portrait painter whose style is that of illustrative idiosyncrasy. She paints oil on canvas, and she tells us through her imagery of people who one way or another were part of her life in New York. It's a visual social history of that time. The ethos, then, was an art world dominated by the critic Clement Greenberg and his push for abstract expressionism. Large canvases filled the studios, ladders clanked. Abstract expressionism was the only form to be accepted. Figurative art was out. Painters dripped paint through blobs at giant canvases, painting a tedious stripe here or there with a Greek name, and so on. That was the order of the day, until pop art came along with its huge blow-up cartoons of Slam and Wham and Andy Warhol's celeb cult. But she ignored all that and quietly enjoyed her figurative pursuits, using such an archaic thing as an easel. She managed to continue working despite a rather hectic and at sometimes tragic personal life. She was the mother of 2 daughters who lived with their father and a son, Hartley. Her left-wing politics and her survival as a painter, despite the odds in that hostile art world, made her a feminist icon in 70s New York. She was commissioned to paint Kate Millett, the feminist, in 1974 for Time magazine. The only person Andy Warhol allowed to portray him was Alice Neel. She painted him after he was shot. I was lucky enough to see her show when it came to the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 2010. I would describe Alice Neel's work as at its best when it's at its most idiosyncratic. It is interesting to see women painting men as they see them, rather than as men see themselves, and valuable for us to have women who went before us to show us that it is possible to be part of that art world out there, even if we do like painting babies. So, if not the greatest painter of all time, Alice Neel is a valuable one.
I could have been a great psychiatrist, but it's more fun being an artist. I see what's there. I don't look for anything, I just look. I tell you what, Cézanne, know what Cézanne said? Cézanne said, I went to a show of his long ago at the Metropolitan, and I was surprised at all the psychological acumen that his portraits had, because I didn't expect them to.
Yeah.
He said, I love to paint people who have grown old naturally in the country. And I say, I love to paint people torn to shreds by the rat race in New York.
I think that she has really allowed the personal portrait to survive, the expressive portrait to survive. And I think that she's also functions as a kind of example for women artists and for some male artists also, that it is possible to be way out there on a limb. I find more and more that that's the kind of art I'm interested in, that's the kind of artist I'm interested in. The person who is dedicated to their vision and doesn't swerve this way and that way according to fashion, and has some commitment and perseverance. And Alice is certainly an example of that.
I think she was a very important figure, especially, in the 70s, partly because she was a fighter. She'd had a very hard life, a very up and down kind of life. She didn't have success until quite late. Her success, except for a very small group of people who knew her work, was intimately tied both with the New Realism and, above all, with feminism. I mean, it was feminist writers, feminist critics who really began to talk about her and began to see her as a new kind of woman artist, very forceful. She was very outspoken. She had a very strong ego. I mean, she loved to talk about herself and her own achievement. And fine, I mean, she was entitled to it. She was a prima donna. Her daughter-in-law really took care of her in many ways. But she, when a male artist does that, you think, oh, well, Picasso, why shouldn't he have, he's a genius. But of course, when a woman artist does that, it has different meanings. They become a prima donna or an egomaniac. But she was acting like, artists have often acted. She was not a shy, modest flower.
Thanks for joining the art appreciation class today on Alice Neel. This is Judy Shintani from Foothill College, and I'll see you next time.